The next entry in our glossary series, in going in alphabetical order, is Or Yashar and Or Chozer. Or Yashar means direct light, Or Chozer means rebounding light or indirect light. Or Yashar means light that emerges from the source based on the source alone. Or Chozer means light that emerges from the source based by an initiative of something that's outside of the source that motivates it, that brings it forward. In order to explain Or Yashar and Or Chozer, I need to touch on a very sensitive subject just for a moment. It's a very sensitive subject, but I need to touch on it anyway. We spent a lot of these entries talking about it itself, about godliness. All of Kabbalah is about godliness. All of Kabbalah is about something that's not God anymore and not creation yet. That's how we call it. And the phenomena of godliness changes the entire landscape of Yiddishkeit and the entire definition of our relationship with Hashem. We all understand that. It's incredibly profound. It changes everything. But before there's Oyer, there's Moir. Moir means the source. Capital S-O-U-R-C-E. Hashem is the source of the light. Moir and Er, the luminary from which the light emerges. Now, even godliness is really God. Certainly the source of godliness is God. Nevertheless, when you learn Chassidus, and this is a topic that our Rebbe touched on more than the earlier Rabbi, perhaps exclusively, the Rebbe would argue that there is an absolute line in the study of Kabbalah and Chassidus. And that absolute line is the line of logic. Or to use the expression in the Gemara, this is Torah and I need to study it. It's a cardinal law. If something is written in the Torah, it is logical, it is Chachmas Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they have a right and an obligation to understand it. And God himself is outside of those parameters. God is Nimna Nimnois, God is above reason altogether. And on this basis, the Rebbe makes an argument that any time you study anything in Chassidus and Kabbalah, the very notion that we're attempting to understand it means that it's within the parameter of what's understandable. And that there's something outside of those parameters which are beyond their comprehension altogether. To say it in different words, the Rebbe would argue the very idea that something is given a name, a label, especially if the name on the label that it's given is descriptive, as the word moed is descriptive, it has limitations, it has bounds. And therefore, even though basically, and I guess in this case it's correct to use the word basically, it's not simplistic. Moed is the Eibishter, Moed is Atzmus. Very, very specifically, the very, very fact that we define him as Moed means that even though Moed means the Eibishter, it means Moed is the Eibishter in as much as the Eibishter can be understood, as much as God can be understood, but his truth is completely beyond that. Which essentially means that we're literally speaking out of both sides of our mouth. On the one hand, Moed means God, period. If godliness really is nothing other than an expression of God, God is certainly, the source of godliness is certainly that. But at the same time, the very fact that we're understanding it and that we're studying it is a proof that it has a definition and therefore it's outside. It's not Atzmus. How could both of those two be simultaneously true is an issue that the Rebbe touches on a little bit, but it's a very, very sensitive area. The Rebbe himself started the conversation and then abruptly ended it because he felt people were not fully understanding it. But what I just shared is directly from the Rebbe's teachings. I did not make this up. The reason I'm bringing this up is because anytime we talk about godliness, and specifically when we talk about godliness in this so-called form of light, as opposed to, let's say, vessels or darkness, we're associating light with luminary. We're associating oil with moed. godliness emerges from God in as much as God is called Moed. The reason this is significant is because it explains, it sets up the logic to understanding this notion of Yashar and Chozer, direct light and indirect light. Now I'm moving on to another subject, okay? I'm changing the subject. One of the many complications about Ein Sof, which I talked about in the classes and the glossary entries that I did on Ein Sof, and even on the glossary entries that I did on Oyer, is the notion of a derech mamela and retainis, that godliness emerges from God passively. He's not giving, it's emerging from passively. The upside of that is that it's a perfect reflection of Him. The downside of that is that it's only reflection, there's nothing of His essence inside. And at the same time, godliness emerges from God willfully, because if it's compelled, if He has no choice, then Chas v'Shalom, He has no control over the light, which is, from a perspective of Achas Hashem, terribly problematic. So, controversy notwithstanding, and like I said, we touched about it in other entries, and this Torah never finishes. You never finish learning it, never finish trying to understand it. One of the big deficiencies in the Oyer Moyer model, in the notion that God is a source for light and light emerges from Him, and that the light emerges from Him passively. Which means on the one hand it's a perfect reflection of Him, but on the other hand the depth of what He is not invested because He's not giving it, it's emerging passively. And again, it's controversial because of the question of Retzainus, but putting the controversy aside, that principle, that Oyer emerges from Moed Memela, and therefore Oyer is only a ha'ara. That's the Hebrew for what I just said, right? The light emerges from the source with a capital S passively. And therefore the light, on the one hand, reflects the source completely, but on the other hand, it's only a trace of what the source is, none of what the source is itself is invested, sets up our understanding of the notion of direct light and indirect light. Direct light means a very simple thing. You have a source, and light radiates from that source. So the light which is closer to the source is going to be more concentrated than the light which is farther from the source. The light which is closer to the source is going to be a more precise reflection of what the source is, and the light which is further from the source is going to be a thinned out version of what that source is. It's common sense. And of course this principle would apply to levels of Ein Sof, the various levels of godliness, the different worlds, and it would even apply to the individual spheres. The difference between the Ein Sof of Chochmah and the Ein Sof of Bina, right? The Eitz Chaim brings, Chassidus quotes it, that Ein Sof is Bekir of Mokum, its relationship to the Ein Sof is close. Bina is Berichok Mokum, is more distant. Zah is Derech Alein, Zah is like through a window, and Malchus Derech Nekev is like through a crack. And there's Maimonides Chassidus that explore all of these things, which is why I know them. I'm not a student of Kabbalah. So there is higher and lower in godliness, both in terms of worlds, and there's higher and lower in godliness within the individual spheres of each world. And the constant in all of that is that the light radiates from the source. And of course, you must appreciate that there is no space. So all of this is a metaphor, and so on and so forth. So higher and lower is not necessarily spatial. It's in terms of how much it reveals the godly source versus how little it reveals the godly source. So the higher levels are closer, not necessarily spatially, but they're closer in terms of the fact that the world is less of a metzius, and the godliness is manifest in a more concentrated way, in a more atzmiistic way, in a way that's more reflection of the source. And on the lower levels, the godliness is somehow thinned out. It's whatever the particular of that may be. That's the principle of Yashar, of direct light. But appreciate that the constant in Yashar is that the light is emerging from the Moed, the source, passively, by itself. Now there's a very important word in Chassidus, a very important word in Chassidus. And this very important word in Chassidus doesn't belong to the Oyer Moyer scheme. It doesn't fit, I don't think, into the Oyer Moyer scheme. The source and the light that manifests from that, and that word is kavanah, the point and purpose of everything. God created the world for a reason. God created Seder Ishtashos for a reason. God created the structure and the form of godliness and how godliness is manifest to worldliness for a particular purpose. Whatever the kavanah is, and of course we know that the kavanah is to bring God into darkness, to transform darkness into light, to bring light into the darkness, to transform the darkness into the light, to make the darkness itself shine, right? Basically, to make this lowest of worlds a home for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the kavanah. The kavanah is not misyaches tamoyer. The purpose for creation is not relating to the idea that Hashem is a source for light. The kavanah is misyaches, the idea that the world has a purpose relates to Him, to the Mechaven, to Hashem Himself, which is higher than the idea of Moed and Oyer, a source for light and light. Whatever higher and lower means, if we're not even talking about godliness, we're talking about God. But as I explained to you before, there is this parameter, there's this line. Whenever we discuss anything, if we're explaining it logically, even if we're talking about Hashem, it's not really Hashem, it's Hashem that can be understood. And again, as I always tell you, when you say Hashem can be understood, you don't mean how Hashem can be understood in free fall. Hashem how is understood based on how it's explained in the Torah. And here it's the other way around. When you add to the scheme the purpose for the creation, since the purpose for the creation is the darkness, since the purpose for the creation is the lower world, since the purpose for creation is the vessels, since the purpose of the creation is the distance, so the lower something has descended, the more rooted it is in that purpose. And as a result of this, there's an entirely different concept of light. When we speak of light as a reflection of the source, so clearly what's closer to the source is greater, what's more distant from the source is less great. But when we speak about divine light, that's not passively reflecting from the source, but divine light that manifests in as much as it's fulfilling the purpose of the creation, now everything is upside down. The lower that divine light reaches, or the lower the trigger or the stimulation that's affecting the manifesting of that divine light, the deeper it is. And that's the meaning of Chozer, rebounding light, reverse, fall backwards. Right, the Rabbi says in Tanya that in the system of Yashar, Chesed is the first sfira and Malchus is the last sfira. And in the system of Chozer, Malchus is the first sfira and Chesed is the lowest sfira. And Malchus being the highest sfira is higher than even how Chesed is the highest sfira. And the additional component here is, it's not just everything is upside down, but that in the reverse model there is the purpose. Not the what, but the why. Why did Hashem create the world? For this, for God to manifest in darkness. And therefore the darker something is, the more associated is with that divine purpose. And the principle is this: there is godliness that emerges from the source passively. And then there is godliness which is called out of the source, either as a means to fulfilling the purpose, or as a consequence of having fulfilled the purpose. Meaning to say, it's not godliness that's emerging passively from the source, it's godliness which is being called out by those who are fulfilling that purpose, which is us. And here everything is upside down. Chozer is higher than Yashar, rebounding light, indirect light. The lower it is, the higher its source. It doesn't necessarily mean it's stronger. It doesn't necessarily mean it's more concentrated. But it means that it's carrying the truth of Hashem, which is above the whole system of Oyer, and maybe even the system of Oyer and Moed. In other words, it's revealing something much, much higher. But the higher idea that's revealing is not defined by its form and by its intensity, but by its association with the fulfillment of the divine purpose. And the way Chassidus explains it to us, when you identify the divine purpose, you identify God Himself, the divine. And that's the meaning of Yashar and Chozer. Yashar means light that emerges from the source because of the principle of the source being a source for light. And Chozer means light which is emerging from the source because someone is calling it forward. And here everything is in the reverse, because now we're dealing not just with the so-called natural state of the emergence of Oyer from Moed, and I really am very uncomfortable using the word nature when talking about such things. And Chozer means the light which is only emerging in terms of fulfilling the purpose of the creation, and the purpose of the creation is to bring light to the darkness, and therefore the darker the elicitor of the light, the deeper the light that emerging is.